right here. This seam isn't welded properly. Are you certain? That's a critical vulnerability. The measurement confirms it. We hit it there.
Across the bridge! Keep firing! Cover them!
There is a moment, and every man who has ever sat inside a steel box on a battlefield knows it, when the ground shakes and the rumble you feel in your chest is not your own engine. It is something else, something out there in the smoke, something you cannot yet see but already fear. I know that moment. I lived it more times than I can count. Across 3 years on 3 different continents, in dust and mud and frozen earth, with the sound of German gunfire, so close I could feel the concussion against my teeth. And for most of those years, that fear was a defining condition of armored combat on the American side of the wire. We drove machines that we knew, and the private knowledge that men carry in their chests during wartime were not adequate to the task they were being asked to perform. We compensated with skill. We compensated with tactics. We compensated with the collective courage of men who understood that the job still had to be done regardless of the conditions under which it was being done. And we watched friends die because compensation was not always enough. But this is not a story about fear. Not entirely. This is a story about the reversal of fear, about the specific, historically documented moment when the equation changed, when the men who had spent years as hunters looked up and found themselves, for the first time, as prey. I am talking about German panzer veterans. Men trained in the finest armored fighting tradition the Second World War produced, operated machines that were, in many technical respects, the most formidable tanks on the European battlefield. Men who had rolled through France in 1940 and the Soviet Union in 1941 in North Africa in 1942 with the absolute confidence that their equipment was superior, that the gap between their technology and the enemy's was wide and durable and would remain so. Those men, in the winter and spring of 1945, began writing letters home that American intelligence officers found worth translating. They began filing after-action reports that German commanders found alarming. They began exhibiting, in their tactical choices and their prisoner interrogation transcripts, the unmistakable signature men who have encountered something they were not prepared for. The cause of that transformation was an American tank, a tank that the Army almost did not build, a tank that arrived late and in small numbers and in the compressed final chapter of the European War demonstrated what it could have accomplished if it had been there from the beginning. This is the story of the M26 Pershing. Stay with me. My name does not matter. What matters is that I was there, from the beaches of North Africa in late 1942 to the crossing of the Rhine in early 1945, sitting in the commander's hatch of American armor through some of the worst fighting this country's sons have ever been asked to endure. I drove a Sherman. I love that tank with a specific affection, a man who has trusted his life to something flawed and been rewarded more often than he deserved. I learned its character, the way you learn the character of anyone you spend enough time with under pressure. Its reliability in cold mornings, its tendency to catch fire in ways that German tanks with their diesel engines did not, the particular sound it made when the engine was about to cause you a problem, the way its suspension handled mud versus snow versus the cobblestones of French and Belgian towns. I knew that tank, and I knew, with equal intimacy, its limitations. The Sherman M4, depending on the variant and the year, was a remarkable machine in certain dimensions and a deeply inadequate one in others. Let me be precise about both, because the Sherman has been both unfairly maligned and reflexively defended by people with agendas on both sides of the argument, and the truth is more complicated and more interesting than either caricature. The Sherman was mechanically dependable in ways that German armor frequently was not. The Tiger I, the machine that the mythology of the Eastern and Western fronts was largely built around, was notoriously difficult to maintain, demanded extraordinary logistical support, and broke down at rates that made it unreliable as a tactical instrument outside of deliberate, set-piece engagements where maintenance could be performed under controlled conditions. The Sherman started in the morning, in North Africa, in the cold of Belgian winter, in the mud of Normandy. The Sherman started. That matters more than people who have not been stranded in a broken vehicle in hostile territory tend to appreciate. The Sherman was fast, faster than the Tiger, faster than the King Tiger, faster than the Panther in most terrain conditions. That speed gave American crews tactical options that heavier German machines did not have: the ability to withdraw under fire, to reposition, to use terrain features in ways that a slower machine could not exploit. An experienced Sherman crew could be infuriating to engage precisely because they were never where you expected them to be 30 seconds after you fired at them. Speed was a form of protection, imperfect and conditional, but real. And the Sherman was produced in quantities that staggered the imagination. Nearly 50,000 of them over the course of the war, rolling off production lines in the United States at rates that no other nation on Earth could have matched. The sheer arithmetic of that production was, ultimately, one of the decisive factors of the entire conflict. You can only kill so many Shermans before you run out of the ability to kill Shermans. But arithmetic is cold comfort when you're the man inside the tank that is being killed. And the Sherman's flaws in the specific context of the European theater against German heavy armor were not minor inconveniences. They were potentially lethal asymmetries. The 75mm M3 gun on the standard early war Sherman was an excellent infantry support weapon and an adequate anti-tank weapon against the German armor of 1941 and 1942. Against the Panzer IV with its long 75, it was marginal. Against the Tiger I and its 100mm of frontal armor, it was functionally useless at standard combat ranges. Against the Panther, which I will argue is actually the most dangerous German tank in the field for most of the Western European campaign, it was worse than useless because the Panther combined adequate armor with a long, high-velocity 75mm gun of such accuracy and penetrating power that it could defeat the Sherman's frontal armor at distances exceeding 1,000 meters, and the Sherman 75 could not reliably reciprocate at any practical range. This asymmetry was not a secret. It was not a surprise discovered on the beaches of Normandy. It was a known, documented, reported, argued about fact that the American Army's institutional structures failed to adequately address for reasons that are worth examining in some detail, because understanding the failure is essential to understanding the significance of the solution. The Army ground forces in the United States, under command of General Leslie McNair, operated according to a doctrine that had been developed in the interwar years and refined through the early campaigns of the war. That doctrine held, at its core, that tanks were not primarily meant to fight other tanks. The tank was an exploitation weapon. Its mission was to penetrate breakthroughs, to operate in the enemy's rear areas, to destroy logistics and communications and command nodes, to spread panic and disruption behind the front lines. Under this theory, the tank did not need to be the best tank on the battlefield in a direct armored duel. It needed to be fast, reliable, available in quantity, and capable of supporting infantry and destroying the lighter resistance it would encounter in the exploitation phase and operation. Anti-tank capability, under this doctrine, was the responsibility of tank destroyers, dedicated vehicles mounting powerful anti-tank guns, fast and lightly armored, designed specifically for the tank versus tank engagement that the doctrine said the tank itself should avoid. The logic was internally coherent. The problem was the battlefield. Battlefields do not organize themselves according to the logical categories of peacetime doctrine. In North Africa, in Italy, in Normandy, and across France, American tanks encountered German tanks constantly in fluid engagements where the neat distinction between an exploitation phase and a defensive holding action was invisible, where there were no tank destroyers conveniently positioned to intervene, where the choice was between engaging with what you had and die without engaging. The doctrine said that tanks should not fight tanks. The German panzers did not share that doctrine. They fought whatever was in front of them with the weapons they had, and what they had was frequently superior to what was in front of them. McNair's theoretical framework, however logical in a staff college seminar, was disintegrating in the mud of actual combat, and the men doing the disintegrating were paying for it with their lives. The ordnance engineers in the United States who had been working on the T-26, what would become the Pershing, since 1942 understood this perfectly well. They were not operating in isolation from the reports coming back from the field. They were reading the same after-action analyses that McNair was reading, and reaching dramatically different conclusions about what those analyses required. By 1943, the T-26 prototype was far enough along to demonstrate that the concept was sound, that the engineering problems were solvable, that a tank with substantially better armor and a 90mm gun was achievable within the constraints of the American industrial and logistical system. They pushed for priority. They argued for expedited production. They found themselves opposed at every turn by an institutional framework that had staked its credibility on the doctrine of tank versus tank avoidance, and that had no mechanism for updating that doctrine in response to evidence that contradicted it. The T-26 sat in development limbo while the arguments went back and forth in Washington, and Sherman crews in Italy climbed into their vehicles each morning carrying the weight of that argument's unresolved outcome. There were individual voices within the Army that understood what was happening and tried to change it. Brigadier General Joseph Collins, who would command the 7th Corps in Normandy and become one of the most effective American Corps commanders of the war, expressed concern about tank gun adequacy before the invasion. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st Army, later acknowledged that he had been given assurances about the Sherman's adequacy that the evidence of the summer of 1944 did not support. The problem was not ignorance at the individual level. The problem was an institutional structure that processed information about battlefield outcomes through a filter of existing doctrine, and that filter was extraordinarily resistant to evidence that challenged its fundamental assumptions. This is not a phenomenon unique to the American Army or to the Second World War. It is how large institutions behave, with a consistency that is as frustrating as it is predictable. The cost of that institutional consistency, in this case, was measured in lives. The summer of 1944 was a moment when the argument could no longer be deferred. American forces came ashore in Normandy in June and almost immediately encountered the full weight of German armor response, including Panthers and Tigers in concentrations that the pre-invasion intelligence estimates had not fully anticipated. The bocage, the network of ancient hedgerows that divided the Norman countryside into a maze of small fields bounded by earthen walls and thick vegetation, channeled armor into lanes where ambush was easy and maneuver was nearly impossible, and in that terrain German tanks with superior guns and superior armor held positions that Sherman crews could not dislodge without catastrophic loss. The casualty figures for armored units in the Norman campaign are stark. Entire tank companies were wiped out in engagements that lasted minutes. Replacement crews arrived at the front having had minimal combat training, climbed into tanks they barely knew, and were destroyed before they learned enough to stay alive. The system was consuming men faster than it could produce them, and the root cause of that consumption rate was a mismatch between American armor capability and German armor capability that the doctrine had insisted was not a problem. General McNair was killed on July 25, 1944, struck by American bombs during Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive that finally cracked a Norman deadlock. The bombs fell short, as they had in other incidents that summer, and McNair was among the casualties. There is a quality of historical irony in his death that is almost too neat. The architect of the doctrine that had sent Sherman crews into inadequate engagements, killed by American ordnance, on the day the Army was finally breaking to the front that his doctrine had helped to make so costly. His death did not immediately change the institutional position on tank development. Doctrines outlive the men who create them, carried forward by the officers who have built their careers around them. But the momentum of events, the evidence accumulating daily from the battlefield, the rising pressure from field commanders, the unmistakable arithmetic of loss rates that could not be explained away, was building to a resolution that the institution could no longer indefinitely defer. Eisenhower, who had the full picture from the Supreme Commander's position and the authority to demand changes that field commanders could only request, made clear in the fall of 1944 that the T-26 program was to be accelerated without further delay. The resistance that had sustained itself for 2 years crumbled relatively quickly once it became clear that it would not survive contact with Eisenhower's priorities. Production of the M26 Pershing, the designation given to the T-26 once it was formally standardized, was authorized and accelerated. The first Pershings arrived in the United Kingdom in late 1944 and were shipped to the European continent in January 1945. The numbers were small, 20 machines initially, assigned to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions for evaluation and operational use. Small, but sufficient to establish what the machine could do. and in doing so, to change the character of armored combat in the theater's final chapter. The Pershing weighed approximately 41 tons in combat configuration. The Sherman M4A3, the standard late-war version that remained the backbone of American armored strength, weighed around 33 tons. Those 8 tons of difference represented a fundamental rethinking of the trade-offs involved in tank design. The Pershing's frontal hull armor was 102 millimeters. Its turret front was 114 millimeters. By comparison, the Sherman's frontal hull was between 51 and 64 millimeters, depending on the variant. The Tiger, I had 100 millimeters of frontal hull armor. So the Pershing was better armored frontally than the Tiger, which had been the standard of what formidable armor looked like in the Western theater for 2 years. The King Tiger, the Königstiger, the heaviest German tank to see significant production numbers, had 150 millimeters of frontal hull armor, which the Pershing could not reliably penetrate at long range on the front. But the King Tiger's side armor was 80 millimeters, and against that the Pershing's gun was lethal at any practical combat range. More importantly, in the geometry of actual combat, the King Tiger was rarely encountered in perfectly frontal aspect. Real engagements happened in rubble and forests and river valleys, where angles were imperfect and flanks were exposed, and in that actual geometry, the Pershing had the advantage. The gun, I keep coming back to gun because the gun is the revolution, the thing that made everything else possible. The 90mm M3 gun installed in the Pershing's turret was derived, like the German 88, from an anti-aircraft weapon, a high-velocity, large-caliber cannon designed to reach and kill aircraft at altitude, whose extraordinary muzzle velocity and projectile weight made it equally devastating against armored targets. Firing armor-piercing ammunition, the 90mm M3 could penetrate approximately 120 millimeters of homogeneous steel plate at 1,000 meters at standard obliquity. The Tiger Eye's frontal hull was 100 millimeters. The Panther's frontal hull was 80 millimeters angled at 55 degrees, which worked out to effective protection equivalent to roughly 140 millimeters against some rounds, but was penetrable by the 90mm AP at normal combat ranges due to ballistic characteristics of the round. The Panther's gun mantlet, which was a weak point that experienced crews new to target, could be defeated reliably against the side armor of any German tank in the field, 80 millimeters on the King Tiger, 45 millimeters on the Panther, 60 millimeters on the Tiger Eye. The 90mm was lethal at any range at which visual acquisition was possible. These numbers translated directly into tactical reality in ways that fundamentally altered how engagements unfolded. German tank crews in 1944 had been trained to fight American armor with a specific set of assumptions baked into their doctrine. At ranges beyond 800 to 1,000 meters, German heavy tanks had an effective engagement envelope against American armor while being largely immune to return fire. Tactically, this meant that the correct German approach to engaging American armor was to find hull-down positions at long range, force the Americans to close distance to get effective shots, and exploit the accuracy advantage of German optics at distance. American crews, understanding this, developed counter-tactics built around using terrain and smoke to close range as quickly as possible, accepting the risk of the approach march to get inside the range where their guns became effective. The approach march was the killing ground. The engagement at close range, if you survived the approach, was survivable. The Pershing changed both halves of that equation. American crews and Pershings had an effective gun at the same ranges where German guns were effective, and they had armor that could absorb hits in the approach that would have destroyed a Sherman. The approach march was still dangerous, but it was no longer the fundamental asymmetry it had been. The tactical vocabulary changed overnight. In February of 1945, during the fighting in the Rhineland as American forces pushed toward the Rhine, the first major documented Pershing engagements established a pattern that would continue for the remainder of the war. A Pershing of the 3rd Armored Division encountered a Panther in a German town. The Panther was hull down, in a position it would have used a devastating effect against any previous American armor. It fired first. The round struck the Pershing's frontal hull and failed to penetrate. The Pershing's gunner found his target, adjusted, fired. 1 round. The Panther burned. The tank commander, a veteran who had driven Shermans from Normandy to the German border, later told the story of the silence that followed. A silence not a shock of the combat, but a mind processing result that violated everything it had learned about how these engagements ended. He was alive. The enemy tank was destroyed. In a Sherman, the first shot from a hull-down Panther at that range ended with American dead. The silence was the sound of a man recalibrating his understanding of what was possible. Similar recalibrations were happening simultaneously in German units. Panzer crews that encountered Pershings for the first time were filing reports that German intelligence officers found alarming. The new American tank did not behave according to pattern. It did not retreat from frontal engagements. It did not require the flanking approach. Its rounds penetrated armor that had been declared impenetrable by the technical standards German crews had been given in prisoner interrogations. Captured German tankers described the experience of engaging a Pershing in terms that intelligence officers flagged as psychologically significant. Not simply the acknowledgement of technical inferiority, but the specific, unsettling experience of finding that the framework of assumptions on which they had built their tactical confidence no longer matched reality. That is a different kind of feat than simply losing an engagement. That is a loss of the mental model that allows you to function in combat, and it is far more debilitating. The engagement at Cologne in March of 1945 is the best documented individual tank action involving the Pershing, in part because a Signal Corps cameraman happened to be present and captured part of it on film. American forces had entered the ruins of the great cathedral city, fighting street by street through rubble that the Allied bombing campaign and German demolitions had reduced to a landscape of collapsed buildings and blocked roads. In the plaza in front of the Cologne Cathedral, one of the few structures that had survived largely intact, its twin Gothic spires rising over the devastation. A Pershing of the 3rd Armored encountered a German Panther at essentially point-blank range. Urban combat removed the range advantage that German doctrine depended on. The engagement was decided by what happened when both vehicles fired simultaneously. The Panther's round struck the Pershing and failed to penetrate the frontal armor. The Pershing's round destroyed the Panther. Moments later, a second Panther appeared from a side street and flanked the Pershing, striking it at a more vulnerable angle. The Pershing was disabled, but the crew survived. A second American tank destroyed the flanking Panther. The entire engagement lasted less than a minute. The footage still exists. You can watch the smoke. You can see the geometry. You can see exactly what changed when American armor finally had a machine that could take a hit and return fire rather than simply burning. The Rhine crossing at Remagen deserves more attention than popular memory has given it. When elements of the 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge on March 7, 1945, and found him probably standing, the demolition charges had failed to fully destroy it before American forces reached the far end. The decision to exploit the crossing immediately rather than wait for a deliberate set-piece operation was one of the pivotal tactical decisions of the final year of the war. Eisenhower later called it one of his most pleasant surprises. The Germans responded with everything available: artillery, Luftwaffe attacks, V-2 rockets, frogmen carrying explosives, and armor attempting to reach the bridge from the east. The bridgehead perimeter that American forces established on the eastern bank was under sustained pressure for the 2 weeks it took to build additional crossing sites downstream, and Pershing tanks defending that perimeter played a significant role in holding it against the German armored counterattacks. The ability to absorb hits from German tank guns and remain in the fight, rather than burning after a single penetration, allowed Pershing crews to hold positions that the calculus of Sherman survivability would have required them to abandon. The bridgehead held. It expanded. The additional crossings were established. The road into Germany was open in a way that the German High Command had believed could be delayed significantly longer, and some portion of the reason it was open was 41 tons of American steel holding the eastern bank. By April of 1945, the German military was in a state that its own officers described, in documents captured after the war, as systemic collapse. Formations that existed on paper had ceased to exist in practice. Supply lines that should have been delivering fuel and ammunition were not delivering fuel and ammunition. The communication network that the Wehrmacht had depended on for its legendary operational flexibility was shredded by air attack and the destruction of the physical infrastructure it ran through. What remained was a collection of isolated strong points, improvised battle groups, and individual units fighting with the desperate intensity of men who had been told for years that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, now discovering that the war they had been fighting was lost, and had been lost for longer than they had been told. Into this landscape, American armor drove with a speed that reflected both the German dissolution and the capabilities of machines now leading the advance. The 3rd Armored Division, which had entered Normandy as a standard Sherman-equipped formation and had paid for the summer campaign at a cost that the division's veterans still found difficult to discuss decades later, drove through central Germany in April 1945 with Pershings at its spearhead. The division's commanding general, Maurice Rose, was killed near Paderborn on March 30th, shot during a close encounter with German tanks attempting to break out of Ruhr Encirclement, one of the war's last significant command casualties on the American side. His death came in the same fighting that saw Pershing tanks engage and destroy King Tigers, the most heavily armored German tanks in production, as those machines tried to escape the trap that had closed around Army Group B, the most powerful German tank of the war. In its final operational deployments, was being hunted by American machines that had not existed in the theater 6 months earlier. The arithmetic of that reversal is exact. I want to spend a moment on what did not happen, because the space between what actually occurred and what might have occurred is where the human cost of the Pershings delay lives. The M26 entered Europe in January 1945. The first units equipped with it were fighting in February. The war in Europe ended in May. That is approximately 4 months of operational experience, with approximately 310 machines in the theater at the time of the German surrender. For months, 310 tanks. In the context of a war that had been running for nearly 6 years and had consumed approximately 80 million lives in total, those numbers are small, but the loss rates in American armored units during those 4 months, compared to the loss rates in earlier phases of the campaign with equivalent equipment, tell a clear story about the difference the Pershing made in the time it had. The crews who drove it in 1945 had a survival probability that crews who drove Shermans in 1944 did not, and that difference is not a statistic. It is men who came home to families that would otherwise have been notified by telegram. The counterfactual: what if the Pershing had been available in the numbers and at the time it should have been, if the institutional resistance had been overcome sooner, if the T-26 program had been prioritized when the ordnance engineers first recognized its necessity in 1942 and 1943, is not idle speculation. It is a question with a calculable human answer, even if the exact figure is uncertain. The casualty rates in American armored units during the Rhineland campaign with Pershings available compared to the casualty rates during the Normandy and pursuit phases without them suggest a significant difference in armored combat survivability. Extrapolate that difference across 18 months of armored combat in France and Germany, across the tens of thousands of tank engagements that occurred during that period, and the number of additional American lives that might have been preserved becomes very large. That number has no memorial. It is the count of men who did not die because a machine arrived in time, and the larger count of men who did die because it arrived late. History owes them both an accounting. The Pershing story did not end with the German surrender in May 1945. The machine remained in American service through the immediate post-war period, and when the Korean War began in June of 1950, with North Korean forces crossing the 38th parallel, equipped with Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, the Pershing returned to combat. The T-34 was a machine of formidable reputation earned on the Eastern Front, where it had been the backbone of the Soviet armor force that ultimately broke the Wehrmacht. It was fast, mechanically reliable, well-armored for its weight class, and equipped with a high-velocity 85mm gun that outclassed anything the first American defenders in Korea were fielding in the initial weeks of the war. The parallels to the early American experience in World War II were uncomfortably close. Inadequate equipment, tactical setbacks, the painful process of learning what the enemy's armor could do and calibrating a response. The Pershing was deployed to Korea in response, and when it met the T-34, there was no contest. The 90mm gun that had been designed to defeat the Tiger and the King Tiger made short work of a tank that, despite its formidable Eastern Front record, was fighting outside its weight class. The Pershing's armor absorbed T-34 fire. The T-34's armor did not absorb Pershing fire. The engagement rates in Korea, once Pershings were in the field, confirmed in a different theater and against a different enemy what the Rhineland fighting had demonstrated in 1945, that the M26 was a decisive weapon whose capabilities had not been fully utilized in the war for which it was designed. Korea extended the Pershing's operational record in ways that gave historians additional data points. But the essential character of the machine was established in 1945 in the frozen Rhineland at the Cologne Cathedral Plaza on the eastern bank of the Rhine at Remagen. In the streets of a dozen German towns whose names have largely faded from the historical memory of the Western Front, it was established in the quiet moments after engagements, when veteran crews who had spent years compensating for the limitations of the Sherman sat in a different machine and processed the new reality of what survival in armored combat looked like when the tool was adequate to the task. It was established in the prisoner cages, in the captured correspondence, in the after-action reports from German units that American intelligence translated and filed, and that constitute, across their accumulated weight, an undeniable record of an enemy's fear. That record is the Pershing's monument. It is more durable than steel. There is a particular kind of forgetting that history does to the machinery of war. When that war ends quickly, the weapons that were decisive in the final phase of conflict, the ones that prove what might have been possible earlier and at lower cost, tend to be absorbed into the general narrative of victory and lose their individual identity. The Pershing arrived in time to fight for 4 months, and then the war was over, and the dramatic weight of D-Day and the Bulge and the liberation of the concentration camps occupied the historical imagination in ways that left little room for the story of what happened in the Rhineland in early 1945. The men who drove Pershings came home to the same welcome as the men who drove Shermans, filed the same paperwork, went back to the same lives. The machines were put in storage, shipped to Korea, eventually found their way into museums. The fear they had inspired in the German crews they destroyed was filed in archives and largely forgot. I am trying to undo some of that forgetting today. Not because the Pershing is more important than the other machines or the other battles or the other stories of the war. It is one piece of a vast and terrible mosaic, and I am under no illusion that a single tank type, however capable, determine the outcome of a conflict of that scale. But it is a piece that has been missing from the popular understanding of the war, and its absence distorts the picture. The story of American armor in the Second World War is frequently told as the story of the Sherman. Its virtues, its flaws, the debate about whether it was adequate to the task, the mythology of the Tommy Cooker and the death trap. That story is real and it deserves to be told, but it is not the whole story. The whole story includes a machine that came after, the machine that was supposed to come sooner, the machine that proved in 4 months what 18 months of Sherman casualties had argued in blood. The whole story includes the M26 Pershing, and today I have tried to give it the telling it deserves. Thank you for the time you have given this story today. If it meant something to you, and I believe it should, because the men who made are almost all gone now and the time for honoring them in living memory is very nearly past, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The way history survives is through the people who care enough to keep telling it, who refuse to let the extraordinary experience of ordinary men be reduced to a footnote in someone else's more famous account. The Pershing was not a footnote. The men who crewed it, who trusted in the final terrible months of the worst war this world has ever fought, were not footnotes. Subscribe, and let me keep making that argument alongside you for as long as there are stories worth telling. I will see you at the next one. The story of the Sherman 76mm gun upgrade deserves its own chapter in the history of American armored adaptation, because it represents an intermediate step between the inadequacy of the original 75 and the decisive capability of the Pershing's 90, and it illuminates the difference between incremental improvement and genuine transformation. Beginning in the summer of 1944, American forces began receiving Shermans equipped with the M176mm gun, a longer and higher velocity weapon that offered meaningfully better anti-arm performance than the 75. The 76mm could defeat the Panther's frontal armor under certain conditions, at close range, against the relatively thinner sections of the gun mantlet or lower hull. It was a real improvement, and crews who transitioned to the 76mm Sherman felt it, as such, the way you feel any improvement in the odds that are governing your survival. But it was not a solution. The 76mm Sherman was still outgunned by the Panther at long range, still outgunned by the Tiger at any practical combat range, still vulnerable to both in the frontal aspect that defined most of the engagements in the bocage and the urban fighting of the autumn campaign. The Army had taken a machine that was outgunned and made it less outgunned. That was not the same as making it adequate. The Pershing made it adequate. The distinction mattered enormously to the men inside the tanks. There's a chapter of the story that almost never gets told, and it involved the role of German intelligence, not in the sense of their information-gathering operations, but in the sense of how accurately or inaccurately the German High Command understood what was coming. Throughout 1944, German intelligence had access to reports about American armor development, including some information about the T-26 program. What they chose to do with that information, and how it was filtered through the assumptions of German armor doctrine, is a study in how intelligence can fail not through lack of information, but through the distortion of existing frameworks. German tank commanders in 1944 were confident that their armor was superior, and that confidence was justified by the evidence of every engagement they had fought against American armor up to that point. The Tiger was proof against American tank guns at standard ranges. The Panther outranged and outgunned any American tank in the field. The entire tactical framework German commanders operated within was validated daily by outcomes on the battlefield. When reports about a new American tank with a 90mm gun reached the appropriate desks, they were assessed against a framework that had no experience of American armor being genuinely dangerous at range, and they were discounted accordingly. The Germans knew something was coming. They did not fully believe what it was until they encountered it. And by the time they encountered it, there was not enough war left to develop an adequate response. The supply and training of replacement crews for Pershing tanks represented a challenge that the Army handled in ways that illuminate the institutional learning process of wartime. When the decision was made to deploy the Pershing to Europe, the question of who would crew it was not simple. The 90mm gun required different training from the 75 and 76mm weapons that Sherman crews were familiar with. The fire control was different. The ballistics were different. The engagement ranges at which the gun was most effective were different from the ranges Sherman crews had learned to work at, and the psychological adjustment to fighting in a machine that could absorb hits and return devastating fire, after years in a machine where absorbing hits was typically fatal, was not automatic or immediate. The Army chose experienced Sherman veterans rather than fresh replacements for the initial Pershing units, reasoning that combat experience was more valuable than weapon system familiarity, and that experienced men could adapt faster than inexperienced ones could learn both the machine and the battlefield simultaneously. The reasoning was sound. The adaptation was fast. In the compressed timeline of the final campaign, crews who had been driving Shermans in October were fighting Pershings effectively in February, carry with them the accumulated tactical knowledge of a year of hard combat, and applying through the lens of machine that finally allowed them to execute tactics they had always known were correct but could not always safely attempt. The logistics of deploying 41-ton tanks across a European theater that had been built around 33-ton Shermans were exactly as complicated as the doctrine's opponents had predicted, and the resolution of those complications tells you something about the difference between peacetime planning constraints and wartime improvisation. Bridges had to be evaluated, and in some cases reinforced before Pershings could cross them. Tank transporters rated for lighter vehicles had to be assessed for whether they could safely carry the additional weight. Maintenance facilities had to be stocked with components that were not interchangeable with Sherman parts. None of this was insurmountable. All of it required effort and planning, and some additional logistical overhead that the doctrine's offenders had cited as a reason not to build the tank in the first place. In the event, the overhead was absorbed without significant disruption to operations, which demonstrated that the logistical arguments against the Pershing had been weighted too heavily. The 41-ton machine crossed the Rhine on the same bridges that carried the 33-ton Shermans, after the engineers did what engineers invariably do. They solved the problems that presented themselves rather than refusing to cross bridges because they were not theoretically designed for the load. The doctrinal argument that logistics constraints made the Pershing impractical was, in combat, revealed as an argument about planning convenience rather than operational reality. The accounts left by German prisoners who had fought against Pershings are worth examining in detail because they constitute a primary source record of psychological impact that official histories tend to understate. American intelligence officers conducting prisoner interrogations in the spring of 1945 noted a consistent pattern in the responses of captured German tankers who had encountered the new American machine. The questions asked were standard: unit designation, last known position, equipment available, unit morale. The answers had deviated from a formulaic prisoner. Responses tended to cluster around observations about American armor. Captured Panther crews described a new American tank they had not expected. They described the experience of firing on it and watching their rounds fail to penetrate. They described the follow-on shot from the American machine. Some described the tactical confusion that resulted when the doctrine they had been trained to apply, the one that relied on the asymmetry of German gun and armor superiority, produced outcomes that doctrine was not designed to accommodate. Intelligence officers flagged these reports, cross-referenced them against unit positions and timelines, and built a picture of how the Pershing was propagating through the German armored forces' awareness. The picture showed a recognition that spread faster through informal soldier communication than through official channels. By February 1945, captured German tankers who had not personally encountered a Pershing knew about it anyway, had formed opinions about it, and carried those opinions into captivity. That informal propagation is, in military psychology, among the most reliable evidence of genuine impact. Men talk about what actually affects them. There is a detail in the Pershing's technical history that deserves mention because it illustrates something about the relationship between weapon development and battlefield reality that tends to get lost in abstract discussions of armor specifications. The suspension system used on the M26 was a torsion bar arrangement, the same basic system the Germans had been using on their Panthers and Tigers, representing a significant improvement over the vertical volute spring suspension of the earlier Shermans. The torsion bar system gave a substantially better ride, and, more importantly for combat, allowed the gun to be engaged with greater accuracy over rough terrain and in some circumstances on the move. This is a detail that matters in a specific and concrete way. A gun that can only be fired accurately from a complete halt is a gun that requires you to expose yourself to enemy fire long enough to stop, acquire, aim, and shoot. A gun that can be engaged with some effectiveness, while moving is a gun that gives you options you did not previously have, that compresses the window during which you are a stationary target. The Pershing's combination of improved suspension and better gun translated into a broader envelope of effective engagement conditions, which translated into tactical flexibility that Sherman crews had not possessed, which translated, ultimately, into most fundamental metric of armored combat, the survival of the crew inside the machine. What the Pershing represented, beyond its specific technical capabilities, was a demonstration that the American industrial and engineering system could produce a machine capable of meeting the best German armor on equal or better terms in a direct confrontation. That sounds like a modest claim, but it was not modest in context. For 2 years, the working assumption on both sides of the wire was that German armor had a fundamental qualitative advantage over American armor, that this advantage was durable, and that American success depended on compensating for it through numbers, logistics, and tactical skill rather than through capability equivalence. The Pershing rendered that assumption obsolete. It demonstrated that the gap could be closed, that American engineering could produce what the battlefield required, and that the failure to do so sooner was a failure of institutional decision-making rather than a failure of industrial capacity. That demonstration had implications beyond the European theater and beyond the Second World War. It was a proof of concept for what American armor development could accomplish when the institutional constraints that had delayed the Pershing were removed, and it shaped the armor development programs that followed the war's end in ways that are still visible in American military equipment today. Let me take you inside the experience of a specific kind of training that Pershing crews received before their first combat engagement, because it illuminates something about how armies prepare men for the gap between what they have practiced and what they will face. At the replacement depots in England and later in France, crews transitioning from Shermans to Pershings went through familiarization courses that were, by the standards of wartime training, unusually thorough. The Army had learned by 1940 for the cost of putting inadequately prepared crews into combat, and investment in Pershing crew training reflected that learning. Gunnery had extended ranges, using the new ballistic tables for the 90mm, fire control procedures for a system that had different characteristics than the 75 and 76mm weapons they knew, maintenance procedures specific to the torsion bar suspension and the more complex turret drive mechanism, communication protocols for coordinating with Shermans in mixed formations, because the Pershings would not replace the Shermans wholesale. They would operate alongside them, leading spearheads and handling the heavy German armor, while the Shermans handled everything else. The men who went through that training described it, in the accounts they left, with a particular kind of attention that reveals what it meant to them. They were being prepared to fight in a machine that changed the rules they had been living under. That changed the quality of their attention. The mathematics of armored combat loss in the European theater, when examined with the care that post-war analysis allowed, revealed patterns that the men fighting in the middle of the campaign could only sense rather than measure. American armored divisions in the Normandy campaign and the subsequent fighting across France suffered tank losses at rates that, relative to the number of enemy tanks destroyed or disabled in the same engagements, reflected the asymmetry of capability that I had described at length. The exchange ratios were unfavorable. For every German tank knocked out by American armor in a direct tank versus tank engagement, American losses were in some periods and some sectors significantly higher, a reflection not of courage or skill of American crews, which were exceptional by any standard, but of the mathematical reality that a tank with a gun that cannot defeat the enemy's frontal armor at standard combat ranges is going to absorb more hits before achieving a kill than a tank that can defeat that armor efficiently. The Pershing changed the exchange ratio. In the engagements where Pershing-equipped units fought German armor in the Rhineland and the final drive into Germany, the exchange ratios shifted dramatically in the American favor. Those numbers are not available for public recitation in their full detail, as many of the relevant records remain in archives that general audiences cannot easily access. But the pattern is consistent and well established in the specialist literature. The Pershing killed more German tanks per American tank loss than any other American armored vehicle of the war in its brief operational period. That is the cleanest single measure of what the machine accomplished. I want to spend a moment on the men who argue for the Pershing against the institutional resistance, because they deserve acknowledgement alongside the crews who fought in it. The ordnance engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground and at the tank production facilities who have been documenting the inadequacy of the 75mm gun since 1942 and pushing for the T-26 program at every available forum. They were right, and they knew they were right, and they spent years watching men die in part because the institution was slow to accept that they were right. General Andrew Bruce, who commanded the Tank Destroyer School and later the 77th Infantry Division, was among those who argued persistently for improved tank armament. The engineers at Fisher Body Division of General Motors who worked on the T-26 prototype through the long months when it seemed like the program might be canceled entirely. Their patience and persistence were as important to the Pershing's existence as any tactical decision made on the battlefield. History tends to honor the men who fought in the machines and the generals who commanded the campaigns. It honors less often the engineers and the officers who fought the bureaucratic battles that determined what machines will be available to fight in. The Pershing story is also their story, and it is incomplete without them. The final weeks of the war in Europe, from the Rhine crossing in late March to the German surrender on May 8, 1945, were a period of extraordinary operational tempo for American armored forces. Distances that would have required weeks of fighting in the attritional conditions of the Normandy bocage were covered in days as the German military structure dissolved. Pershings at the spearhead of the advancing columns encountered a battlefield that was simultaneously chaotic and, at the command level, increasingly unresisting, isolated strong points of fanatical resistance surrounded by areas of complete German collapse, the specific tactical geography of a military machine in its final dissolution. In those conditions, the Pershing's capabilities were not always a decisive factor. A surrendering Wehrmacht soldier does not require a 90mm gun. But when German armor did make a stand, when a King Tiger or a surviving Panther attempted to delay the advance or cover a German withdrawal, the outcome of the engagement was decided faster and at lower cost of American forces than any comparable engagement in the previous year had been. The accumulated effect of those faster, lower-cost resolutions, fewer American dead, fewer American tanks burning, fewer delays in the advance, was an acceleration of the campaign's end that is difficult to quantify precisely, but impossible to dispute in principle. The question of how the Pershing fit into the larger American industrial narrative of the war is worth exploring, because it sits at the intersection of the war's two most important American stories, the story of the fighting men and the story of the production miracle that equipped them, The United States had committed at the industrial level to a war-winning strategy built on volume. Volume of ships, volume of aircraft, volume of tanks, volume of ammunition. The deliberate decision to overwhelm the Axis production base with quantities that the Axis powers, constrained by geography and resource access, could not match. Within that strategy, the Sherman made perfect sense. It was a tank you could build in enormous numbers, maintain in the field, ship across an ocean, and replace when lost. The strategy was sound, and it was ultimately correct. The sheer weight of American production was one of the decisive factors of the conflict. But the strategy had a cost that did not show up in production statistics, and that cost was paid in the tank crews of 1943 and 1944, who drove machines that could be produced in volume, but could not adequately defeat the enemy's best armor. The Pershing represented a partial correction of that imbalance, not an abandonment of the volume strategy, but a recognition that volume without adequate capability was buying victory at higher human cost than was necessary. The Army did not build enough Pershings in time to make that correction fully, but the correction was made in the time that remained, and the record of what it accomplished is there to be read. There is a conversation that happens in every war between the men who are fighting it and the men who are managing it, and that conversation is almost never entirely satisfactory from either direction. The men in the field see the specific costs of specific decisions with an immediacy and a concreteness that is not available to the men managing the overall campaign. The men managing the overall campaign see the full complexity of competing priorities, resource constraints, and strategic trade-offs that the men in the field cannot see from their position inside a single tank in a single engagement. Both perspectives are necessary. Neither perspective alone is sufficient. The story of the Pershing's delayed deployment is, in part, a story about that conversation failing, about a gap between what the field was reporting and what the institutional structure was hearing, mediated by a doctrinal framework that had its own gravity and momentum and that did not update itself quickly enough to reflect the evidence that was accumulating. I am not prepared to say that every officer who argued against the T-26 program was wrong in some simple, accusable way. The arguments they made were not frivolous. The concerns they raised were real. What they lacked was a final authority, the thing I had, and they did not, which was the experience of sitting inside a tank that could not reliably kill what was shooting at it, and knowing what that did to a man's chances and a man's mind. That experience, scaled across the tens of thousands of American tank crews who had it in 1943 and 1944, was the argument that eventually overwhelmed the doctrine. The Pershing was its answer. The specific men who crewed the Pershing in its first engagements left accounts of varying completeness, some formal, in the after-action reports that units were required to file, and some informal, in letters and interviews conducted years and decades later by historians who understood the significance of what had happened in those months. Reading across those accounts, you find a consistency that is more persuasive than any individual testimony would be alone. The consistency is not in the specific details of specific engagements, though many of those details align with the documentary record. It is in the tone of the thing, in the quality of attention that men pay to a changed circumstance. Men who've been operating under conditions of chronic disadvantage and then find that disadvantage removed, describe a removal in a specific emotional register, not triumphant, not even fully relieved, but something more like recalibration, like the mind working to update a threat model that has been the organizing framework of its survival for a long time. You do not simply forget, overnight, the habits built around the knowledge that your gun cannot kill a machine that is trying to kill you. You carry those habits for a while after the conditions that created them have changed. The Pershing crews described exactly that experience. The persistence of Sherman crew habits in a machine that no longer required them, the gradual, engagement by engagement process of learning that new tactics were possible because new capabilities were available. That recalibration, written in the words of the men who underwent it, is among the most honest and direct accounts of what the Pershing's arrival actually meant at the human level. I keep returning to the number 310 because that number contains within it the full moral weight of what the Pershing story ultimately represents. 310 tanks in a theater of war that had seen tens of thousands of tank engagements over the previous 8 months. 310 machines arriving in January 1945 when they should have arrived, when the engineering was ready, when the need was documented and urgent, in mid-1943. The gap between when they should have arrived and when they did arrive was filled by Sherman crews doing the best they could with the machines they had, and the cost of that gap was paid in the specific currency of young men's lives, in families that received telegrams, in towns across the United States that lost sons and brothers and husbands to engagements that the right machine, available at the right time, might have survived. The 310 Pershings that arrived in time to fight in 1945 changed the outcomes of the engagements they participated in and preserved the lives of the crews who fought in them. The machines that should have arrived in 1943 and did not. Call them the Ghost Fleet, the counterfactual armor that exists only in the space between what the engineers built and what the institutions allowed. Their absence shaped the casualty list of 1943 and 1944 in ways that no memorial has ever adequately honored. I am honoring them now, in the only way available to me, which is to say plainly what happened and why, and to refuse the comfortable simplification that would reduce the story of American armor in the Second World War to a tale of industrial triumph and institutional wisdom. It was a triumph. It was also a failure, corrected late, at great cost. Both things are true, and both deserve to be told.